Which one is better, knight or bishop? In this video, we will cover various different key principles as well as situations when the bishop is able to dominate the knight and vice versa. Timestamps are in the description. Enjoy the video. When you are in bishop versus knight endgames, there's one key detail that you have to look at, and that is whether there are pawns on only one side of the board or both sides of the board. So principle number one is going to be pawns on both sides of the board, such as this one right here, because there are pawns on the king side and on the queen side as well. So pawns on both sides of the board benefit the bishop. Because bishop is a long-range piece, it can attack many things at the same time and it can pressure many things at the same time, while the knight struggles to do that because it needs some time to move and maneuver around the board. So this position right here is much better for the white pieces. But if we were to change this position a little bit and take this position, for example, now the position is very equal because the pawns are only on one side of the board and not on both sides of the board. And this is significantly easier for the knight to deal with. And let me give you a very practical example. So this position right here was played in 1987 between Anatoly Karpov, former world champion, versus Andrei Sokolov. In this position, Sokolov was playing with the black pieces and he had a choice. Which pawn do you capture? The position is black to play. Do you capture the pawn on e4 or do you capture the pawn on a4? Well, as it turns out, capturing on a4 is a significantly better move, and it is the only move in the position that actually draws the game for black. Taking on e4 is actually losing for the black pieces. After the move king b5, this pawn is simply going to be lost, and pawns on both sides of the board benefit the bishop, not the knight. Had Sokolov captured the pawn on a4, now there would have been pawns only on the one side of the board, not on both sides, and this would have been significantly easier for black to handle, because even if king to b5 was played anyways, because black is not going to be able to hold on to this b6 pawn. However, now the knight comes back, attacks this pawn, and this position is significantly easier to defend, because after, let's say, a move like e5, you can play moves like knight to d3, go after this pawn. However, Sokolov in the game made the wrong choice. He allowed Karpov to have pawns on both sides of the board, and Karpov used this to his advantage and went on to win the game. Another important detail that you have to consider in bishop versus knight endgames is whether the pawns, and especially opponent's pawns, are frozen or fixed on the same color as your bishop. In this case, black's pawns are all on dark squares, and we have a light square bishop as the white pieces. This means that this bishop is unable to target any of these pawns, and therefore the position is a draw, despite the fact that there are pawns on both sides of the board, which would benefit the bishop. However, there are no tangible targets. You cannot attack any of these pawns. They're all on dark squares. So this brings me to principle number two. Principle number two is going to be to fix your opponent's pawns on the same color as your bishop. In this position, white once again has a light square bishop. That means that we want black's pawns to be on light squares, not on dark squares. We want them to be on light squares so this bishop can target them. And in this case, if we make a random move, let's just say bishop to c4, or let's just say bishop b5, right, attacking this pawn, what black will play is this move a3. Now after a3, we can no longer attack this pawn because it is on a dark square. Therefore, the correct move in this position is to play a3 ourselves, fixing this pawn on the same color as our bishop. This is the same principle that applies in same color bishop endgames, where you want your opponent's pawns to be on the same color as the bishop. It's exactly the same scenario, except in this case our opponent does not have a bishop, he has a knight. And let me show you one more example. This is what can happen if your pawns are fixed on the wrong square. So in this position, we are looking at this from the black's perspective. White is the one with the light square bishop, and white's pawns are on light squares. Well, these ones at least. In this case, what we can play is this move knight to c3, targeting this pawn, and as it turns out, white simply cannot defend this pawn. What's funny is that this is actually not even the best move. If I go back, going after this pawn is not even best. It's better to go knight to d6 and go after the bishop, because this just goes into a winning king and pawn endgame after a5. Go and watch my king and pawn endgame video if you want to learn more about stuff like this. However, knight to c3 is also a potential move here, going after this pawn, and it is a very reasonable move, and white cannot do anything, and white cannot go for a tangible counterattack because black's pawns are either on the dark squares, such as the pawn on b4 and a7, or they're defended by the king, such as the kingside pawns that you see right now. So principle number 3 is going to be the fact that if a knight is on the edge of the board, a bishop can dominate it and cut it from the game. So in a position like this, bishop to d4 would be the winning move for the white pieces, only winning move. And what bishop to d4 does is it basically traps the knight on the edge of the board, because the knight cannot go to b2 or c3, and it cannot go to e3 and f2 either, because the bishop is cutting off both of these diagonals, and all of the forward knight jumps, or all of the knight jumps in general, are covered in this position. Therefore, we can just bring the king and scoop up this knight. If black tries to bring his king, he's not going to be in time, because we're going to take this knight and then we're going to move the bishop away and be up a piece. So remember, don't put your knights on the edge of the board. Knights on the rim are dim, and if your opponent puts the knight on the edge, cut it off with the bishop. Principle number 4 is going to be to try to get a good knight versus a bad bishop situation. So what is a good knight versus a bad bishop situation? A bad bishop situation happens when the pawns are placed on the same color as the bishop. And in this case, there are a lot of pawns placed on light squares, while black has a light square bishop, while black's pawns, at least the central ones, are placed on dark squares, and white can jump the knight forward, attack all of these pawns, and the bishop cannot exactly do the same because it is a bad bishop. And in a situation like this, white would just simply bring the king. Like, let's say a move like king to f2, king e7, king e3. Both sides would simply bring their kings, but there's nothing that black can do. Black can try to push the pawn, but of course the white king is simply going to walk up, and after a couple of moves, this pawn is going to be targeted, the knight's coming to d4, and also this d4 square is an outpost because there are no pawns that can kick it. Even though this e pawn is on e6, it's not going to be pushed anytime soon because this pawn on e5 is completely restricting it, and something's going to be lost here for the black pieces, and black will go on to lose this game. So try to get a good knight versus a bad bishop situation. Dominate the squares opposite of your opponent's bishop. In this case, black has a light square bishop, you dominate the dark squares, and because black's pawns are also on the light squares, nobody's really covering the dark squares here. The bishop operates on the light squares, and if the bishop operates on the light squares, you need the pawns to be on dark squares, because if this bishop controls one color complex, you need the pawns to control the other color complex. If that doesn't happen, you might get into a situation like this where a good knight will be able to dominate the bishop. Let's just say g5, knight to d4, and king f7. We're just going to pick this pawn up, or if the pawn is pushed, we are still going to pick this pawn up because it's still hanging, and this is a completely winning position for the white pieces. Okay, now let's talk about a couple of theoretical positions here, such as bishop and a pawn versus a knight. In this case, white cannot capture the knight on f6 because black would capture the pawn on d6 and the position would be a draw. So we need to make sure we force this king off of the vision of the d6 pawn. Let's just say either d4 or c4, anywhere would be good as long as the king does not see the pawn anymore. Then we would be able to capture the knight and then promote the pawn, or we need to get rid of the knight altogether. However, that's not really possible right now because, as I said, the king cannot capture the knight, and also the bishop cannot attack the knight because it's on a dark square. So the only way we can win this position is if we put black in zugzwang and force the king off of the vision of this pawn. So after a couple of moves, bishop to b3 was the only move here, by the way. This is the only move that wins the game, and we need to remaneuver maneuver the bishop around, just like you see on the screen right now. And after a couple of moves, we get into a situation like this, where if the knight captures on e4, we will simply promote this pawn, because after d7, knight g5, king e7, we are one square away from the knight diagonally. Check out my knight endgame video for that, because I talk about how king can dominate the knight. Here white would simply promote. Or after a move like bishop to e4, if black doesn't capture the bishop, the king has to move away from the vision of the pawn, after which white will capture the knight and then promote the pawn on the next move. Now let me show you another case where this position is not winning, and I understand this was a bit complicated what I just showed you. You cannot really put a finger on a specific principle or a concept in a position like this. You have to calculate and you have to figure out a way to put your opponent in zugzwang, and sometimes there's not going to be a way, such as the position you see on the screen right now. This position is a draw. There's no way to win it theoretically, and that is because the king and the knight are close together, and now it's sort of impossible to get rid of this knight right here because it's on a dark square, and the king will always be able to protect it. So even if you give a check on e4, you give a check here, the king will move away, but there's nothing you can do because the king will just simply go back and forth here, and there's just simply nothing you can do. Let's say you try king e7 to go over here, not gonna work, because after knight to c8 check, knight will simply sacrifice itself for the pawn, and this is a draw due to insufficient material. Same thing will happen if the king goes down, and this is basically what will happen. Thankfully, knight and pawn versus a bishop is very, very simple compared to bishop and pawn versus a knight. In a position like this, if it was white to play, the position would be easily winning. Let's just make a random move, because after knight to c6, the bishop is simply blocked, and white can simply push this pawn and win the game. So this is a very simple idea, and the only way to stop this as the black pieces is to go bishop to e8. And here the position is a draw because you cannot really do anything with the white pieces. Even if you go knight to g4, king to g2, let's say knight to f6, the bishop will simply go all the way over to a4. And the thing is, the diagonal is too big here. There's too many squares here for the bishop. Knight covers e8 and d7, king covers c6 and b5, but there's still this a4 square. Therefore, this position is a draw for the black pieces, and the black pieces are drawing this position. However, if we were to change the position a little bit, now I want you to look at this position closely. I'm going to change it just like this. So I moved every piece one square to the left. Now this position is winning. Even if black goes to d8 and stops this idea of knight to b6, it's simply not going to work, because after knight to f4, let's just say king f2, knight to e6, and then let's just say bishop to a5, the king will go to a6. And the crucial difference here is that all four of these squares are covered. The whole diagonal is covered because it's a smaller diagonal than the other one. It was this diagonal earlier, now it is this diagonal right here. This one has 4 squares, this one has 5 squares. Therefore, this position is winning because there's less squares for the bishop, and king and the knight can simply cover all of these squares. If I can make normal arrows, that would be very nice. And here black is forced to move off of this diagonal, and then white will simply promote, and this is completely winning for the white pieces. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. This one's going to be a bit shorter than my other videos. That's because this endgame knight versus bishop is simply not as theoretically dense as some of the other ones, so this is going to be a bit of a shorter one. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next one. Peace.